Hi everybody, it's Miss O'Connell. We are going to continue our Watergate lesson here. We have 5 sections in this chapter, so you're probably going to get a lecture a day is what we're looking at for this week. I know it's the last week of school, but we got to do what we got to do here. All right, so when we last left off, we had been talking about the Watergate issue. Remember Watergate Hotel break-in by the committee to reelect the president, and they were caught. And the question now begins. The question is whether or not Nixon knew about it or if he tried to help cover it up. So we also discovered that there were tapes that he had recorded while he was in the Oval Office that kind of laid everything out. Obviously, Congress wanted access to those. Nixon said no, citing executive privilege, and then they took it to the Supreme Court in Nixon v. United States. So now we look a little bit more about the fallout. So we have a man by the name of Leon Jaworski, who was the new special prosecutor who was appointed by Richard Nixon. And, I think that a lot of times presidents think that people that they appoint should be their allegiance should be to them. We see it a lot in this administration, and I think we saw it a lot during the Nixon administration. But he wanted to get those tapes because it was his job to figure out if Nixon knew about the break-in and if he tried to cover it up. So he was determined to get those tapes. So in U.S. v. Nixon, we have the Supreme Court, who is forced to basically issue the judgment for Nixon to release those tapes, and the decision is pretty unanimous, 8-0. One person abstained. That's why we don't have 9. We know there's 9 Supreme Court justices, so that we don't have a tie in any instance. So Nixon was ordered to release those tapes. And what they said in the decision was that the president has a right to protect military secrets and other sensitive material and has a right to some confidentiality. But the needs of a criminal trial must take precedence. And if the question is, obviously, Nixon doesn't want to release the tapes because it could implement him. And the Supreme Court is saying, if you're on trial, you can't suppress the evidence, basically. So Nixon surrenders the tapes. So the fallout begins. We're going to have impeachment talks, okay? And if you remember, we talked a lot about impeachment when we talked about Andrew Johnson at the beginning of the year. And a lot of people think that Nixon was impeached, but he wasn't. Had he stayed in office, he most likely would have been. Okay? So the House Judiciary Committee chooses to take action. So they basically sit down, they decide what they're going to charge the president with, and they're going to file 3 charges against him. Okay? The first one is obstruction of justice. The second one is abuse of power. And the third is contempt of Congress for refusing to release the tapes. So obstruction of justice, covering up the Watergate break-in, abuse of power, basically citing because he's the president, he doesn't have to do certain things, and then not releasing the tapes. So these are the 3 charges that are going to be filed against Richard Nixon. So basically, there's going to be an impeachment vote, and Nixon now has to weigh the pros and cons of, do I go forward with impeachment, possibly found guilty and removed from office, or do I resign? So there's also new evidence. There's another tape that's going to be revealed, and it says that Nixon had ordered the CIA to stop the FBI probe into the Watergate burglary. So basically it's saying that Nixon knew what had happened, and he was trying to use his power as president to get the FBI to stop investigating the situation at Watergate. So obviously it makes him look really, really bad. So impeachment and removal from office were inevitable at this point. So Nixon has some tough decisions to make. So resignation. Nixon decides on August 9th of 1974, he is going to announce his resignation. And watch the video, the little clip to the left here I have. Please watch it, because as he's resigning, he doesn't take any responsibility for what he did, okay? He just says that it's in the best interest of the nation to move forward, and they can't move forward without him leaving office. So definitely not willing to cop to what he's done, but he does decide to resign from office because he knows impeachment would come and most likely a guilty verdict. So remember, Spiro Agnew, who had been his vice president, is going to resign because of tax evasion. And so Nixon had appointed Gerald Ford, which the Senate approved. And so Gerald Ford is now going to become president. Okay, and it's interesting and important to note that Gerald Ford has the distinction of being the only U.S. president who was not elected by the American people, but he's appointed. So he never ran on a ticket with Nixon. He's appointed by Nixon and then eventually becomes president when Nixon resigns. So Ford wants Americans to kind of get over Watergate and put the scandal behind them. He says we have to move forward. We cannot dwell on this. And so he is going to do what he thinks is the best option for getting America to get over this. And he issues Richard Nixon a full pardon a month later after he takes office. So the big question becomes, was Ford doing this to actually try to get the American people over what had happened? Or was he doing this because it was a deal that he and Nixon had made? So it's interesting. A lot of historians, a lot of people think that when Richard Nixon chose Gerald Ford as vice president, that he went to Ford and he said, okay, there's a very good chance you're going to be president. And if I make you vice president and you become president, you have to pardon me. Okay, so that's the stipulation of making you vice president, that if there's a chance that charges could be brought up against me, it's your job to pardon me and say that it's a way to get the American people moving forward. So people weren't necessarily happy with Ford. They felt that Nixon needed to pay in some type of way, but it doesn't happen because of the pardon that Ford issues. All right, so the overall impact of Watergate. First of all, the legal effects. There are going to be new laws that are put in place, and they're intended to limit the power of the executive branch. We're going to have the Federal Campaign Act, which limited campaign contributions, and it set up an agency for election laws to make sure that each candidate was following a specific list of do's and don'ts. There's the Ethics in Government Act, which required financial disclosure of all elected officials through all branches. And Congress is going to lay out a means to appoint an independent counsel to investigate and prosecute wrongdoings by the government. Okay, so you saw it in the Trump administration. You'll see it in the Bill Clinton administration, a special counsel to investigate any wrongdoings by members of the government. So Ken Starr was the Clinton investigator. Unfortunately, we won't get to the Clinton administration. And then Robert Mueller was the Trump investigator, who you might remember a little bit more. Okay, so the overall everyday effect of Watergate. First of all, Americans started to develop a distrust of public officials. And this was in turn because of Watergate, but also because of how the U.S. government had led Americans kind of on the wrong path. Remember that credibility gap during the Vietnam War with what the government was saying versus what was actually happening in Vietnam. So there's a ton of similarities between Nixon and this current administration, the Trump administration. So definitely take a look at this video that highlights a lot of that. So there we have Leon Jaworski, who was the special investigator on cover of Time magazine. We have Ken Starr, who was the special investigator for the Bill Clinton perjury issues. And then we have Robert Mueller, who was the special investigator for Donald Trump. So you see 3 Time magazine covers, 3 different special investigators. So definitely a lot of similarities in that instance. Okay. Extra credit. Here, I put this slide in here because I want you to tell me who these 2 individuals are. So if you can tell me that, give me a shout out, and then you'll be able to get extra credit. The one on the right you've probably seen a lot of. I will give you his name. It's William Barr. but I want you to tell me what his role is, and then the man on the left as well. All right, so next we're going to take a look at Gerald Ford, his presidency, and Jimmy Carter. Okay, we only have a couple more minutes on this lecture before my time runs out, but I want to kind of get into this a little bit. So last words on Watergate, as far as, remember Woodward and Bernstein, who had the secret source. Bob Woodward believed that the scandal proved that no one was above the law, not even the President of the United States, and this is one of his quotes on it. He said, "Watergate was probably a good thing for the country. The problem with kings and prime ministers and presidents is that they think that they have some special rights. We have our laws and believe them, and they apply to everyone, which is a good thing." Okay? So he believed that it was a way to kind of keep government officials in check. So in the 1970s, there's going to be a small economic crisis, okay? And the causes of this were, number one, the Vietnam War, obviously. Had sucked a lot of money that could have gone to domestic programs and put it towards the war effort. We had rising oil prices. OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, where we get most of our oil, used oil as a political weapon. And there's going to be a war with Israel and its Arab neighbors. We're going to support Israel, so then oil prices for us are going to go up. And then a lot of Arab members put an embargo on petroleum to countries who supported Israel, so we had to find other ways to get our oil. Also, the price of oil, if we did get to buy it, was raised by 70%, and then by another 130% a few months later. So it made gas prices astronomical. If you've noticed, gas prices today are like $1.59. We haven't seen those gas prices in decades. So the fact that we're seeing those now kind of tells you where our economy is, not necessarily in a great place. But, you know, I remember when gas was 99 cents a gallon. That's how old I am. But, you know, this is to the point where gas would be $8 a gallon, $10 a gallon, because oil prices were so high. So 3 cents per barrel in 1973, that's going to shoot up to $30 a barrel by 1980. And the price per barrel is then going to equate to what people pay, what consumers pay at the gas tank. So the result of all of this was that America had less money for other goods, and that created a recession, because if you have to put so much money towards fueling your cars and everything else you need oil for, you don't have money for other things, like things that are not necessarily needed but wanted, and that's how our economy continues to run in a good way. Another cause of the crisis was declining manufacturing. U.S. factories were very old and inefficient, and by 1971, the United States imported more than it exported for the first time since 1889. You always want to export more. That means you're selling more products, whereas if you're importing, you're buying more products. So factories are going to wind up closing. Millions of people are going to lose their job, and the result is stagflation. And this is the combination of inflation, okay, and a stagnant economy with high unemployment, okay? So the value of money wasn't worth as much, and then the economy was not doing well, and a lot of people were out of jobs. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Tomorrow we'll pick up with the election of 1976, okay? Gerald Ford is going to be a very short-term president for sure. And we'll talk about what happens in 1976. So as always, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to call me, text me, email me. I can't wait to hear from you. I know we're in the last week here, but hang in there. You don't have exams, so I'm going to keep inundating you with this stuff, okay? All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.